what are the common mistakes that you see when people kick off a new game?
Yeah, I think the mistake that I see probably the most often is we're going to develop a pitch and then we're going to see how to, on the cheap, build a really slim version of that pitch to solicit feedback against. And the more narrow and careful we can get at sort of really, it's like, oh, we're going to get an MVP and people are going to play it. And it's fundamentally destructive for a couple of reasons. Like on paper, there is some merit to that argument, but you get burned in a few different ways. First, undercooking how much homework, video game reference that you've played yourself, Twitch streamers that you've watched, like how much homework you've done in the genre beyond the pitch to better inform it, to sort of better prepare yourself to be ready to adapt if you ever have to sort of adjust the pitch, if it's not catching it, like all the things you need to do to sort of support, insights that you need to farm to make sure that that pitch is paired with a firm understanding of kind of what you're about to sort of get into. Like if you have a pitch for a new smartphone and it's a really good idea, like how much do you know about all the smartphones that didn't work and the features of the smartphones that sort of didn't land or did work? Like if you're going to be in the smartphone R&D space, like really, lift weights, get strong, make sure that you're prepared for your pitch to sort of really need adjustment as you go. The second thing I see is teams are often way too quick to budget and target their tooling against a specific pitch. And they're nervous that if they don't sort of get to that pitch sooner than later, they're going to run out of money. They're like that sort of, they're going to bloat their path to it. The problem being that building, really strong technology fundamentals, genre concepts that aren't distractingly broken, and sort of just a well calibrated sort of like set of tools of investigation is what you will need to make the most of your pitch. That if you sort of put it in front of somebody and you get notes, you're not really in a good position to sort of think critically about sort of what merits further investigation and how do you investigate it efficiently, because you just ran to get this thing in your hand to sort of see if it had merit. And often it's through the experiments and the genre fundamentals that you actually get in the right mindset to interpret the audience feedback itself. That you've done the work around the prototype, so you kind of have a better ear for sort of what the audience is saying about the thing that you think probably works. On top of that, I'm pretty big on, don't do the hard, high stakes pitch prototype too soon in your prototyping plan, because you are going to have a bunch of like emotional stakes and bias, and it's going to feel very heavy in a way that's going to distract from what you should be doing, which is taking on a much easier, much more simple derivative set of prototypes just to make sure that your genre fundamentals, your team are all well calibrated to do harder proving and exploration. That you're trying to sort of do the Olympic bar right out of the gate and seeing how fast you can lift it. You got to sort of get a couple practice reps to calibrate that sort of there's not noise in your system, that, not to, say the word science too much, because I feel like it gets pretentious if you say it too much. But like if you're going to be scientific, building a control experiment, which like when you execute it tells you that your team is ready for tougher questions, your tools are ready, your tech's ready, like making sure that you're calibrating your team and your tools and your tech before you take on the lift of sort of giving your pitch an honest shot is critical to make sure you're in a position to make the most of it. So it's like, it might seem roundabout that you're like, well, we're going to sell everyone this magic pitch and it's exciting and we're just so hyped to do it, and we're going to sort of be good producers and good business folk and make sure that we don't have a lot of fat, we don't have a lot of waste, we're going to be focused. But like you're building like a machine that knows how to sort of like ask questions and get fuzzy answers efficiently. And when you go back to get, when you go to that audience to get that validation to sort of see where you're actually at, you're going to be right back in the lab the next day going, okay, so are we committing to this? Is it really validated? Are there elements of it that are working, that are not working? Like, it's just very binary. It's like we got validation or we didn't. And it's like, that's profoundly optimistic that you think that your audience is going to be giving you crisp feedback on a build that has, intentionally half-baked genre concepts, that has a bunch of jank that you have to apologize for with cause, and that like you're going to sort of hear the golden notes that everything's great, everything's fun, and now we can just proceed. But like, I think it's easy to fall into that trap because the more you talk about your pitch, the more you get people excited about your pitch, the team's jazzed to get after the pitch and sort of really, prove it in a way that's playable and inspiring. But it's often in that pursuit that you're skipping your homework. You're skipping your reference homework, you're skipping your tooling homework, you're skipping your genre homework, you're skipping your calibration homework, and you're like putting yourself in this position where it's pretty all or nothing. Like, you better be right, because if it's anything less than right, like, are you going to do it all again? We're gonna pivot wildly, build an entirely new pitch, do that dance all over again. You could spend years trying to do high stakes, waterfalled, mega builds, trying to get just enough audience validation that you get thumbs up. And I feel like it's a losing game. Like it's just like, I think that I like a lot of the good intentions of sort of pursuing audience validation and sort of MVP aggressively, but you really there's always that little bit in there that's sort of like, okay, but are we ready? Did we do the work?
Yeah. No, I when I'm hearing this, it's funny. There's these like competing ideas bouncing around my head, because I've often been somebody who said something like, well, okay, like, pare it down, get something basic out and all that. But I really appreciate what you're saying, in that the word questions kept coming to mind. It's like, at this stage, there's a ton of questions, and those questions aren't just what's the game, it's what's the space, what's the player, what's the the competition, what does good look like? I'll tell you, brought up the smartphone example. Like, why did these phones fail? Why did these phones succeed? Do you know that in your space? Have you gone and looked? Because if you rush ahead and you get a 45-minute playtest session with 40 players or something set up. Okay, well, after 45 minutes, they all said, yeah, that was kind of fun. What does that mean?
Yes.
And if you don't have that background, and you aren't, the thing more so even than the word science, it was like you become a student of the genre, the space that you're trying to enter, the player that's there. Because, some people say, well, I'm trying to make a totally new genre. Well, cool. Find the closest things around it and try to because there's something where you want to be that student who's watching and observing and paying attention. And it's interesting, because I think a lot of people, like, in my mind, I was like, how would I argue against this, right? If I was like, no, you just want to get it out there, you just build the prototype fast and launch it. And I actually think in some circumstances that might be the right move. But what I would say is, like, I would say I tried to use the agile thing of like working software over comprehensive documentation, right? Like one of the core pillars, core value. We're trying to be agile. We want working software over comprehensive documentation. And when I see that, I go, yeah, we're not. What you're talking about isn't necessarily comprehensive documentation. It's actually investment of and what's the word, like, it's living in the world that you want your game to go into.
Yeah,
it's this deep understanding.
I love Riot's development framework documentation, and like one of the really interesting subtle lines that are in there is for prototype to end, you need to sort of like prove you got something. You have to have audience validated that's playable, correct? But the other piece underneath it is the development team's own grasp as to sort of why that's meaningful and what it is. And to get that meaningful grasp is different in video games than it is in almost any other medium, because the rest of the project is going to have multiple opportunities to either bend or change that component or set of components that got you that audience validation. And it's going to sort of test your knowledge as to sort of what makes them tick. And like one of the most expensive things you can do in all of game development is let your designers advance, phases into scaled production phases on components that work well, but they don't understand. And you will wake up one day and realize that you can't pivot them, or you pivot them badly, that you can't iterate upon them. And it's often the prototypes that failed adjacent to the ones that worked that sort of yield the most understanding as to why the prototype that you chose to get audience validation against was smart. And when you get that information from the audience, ideally, your designers like that totally turns on a light. I know what that means. I'm pretty like they can commit to it and canonize it in documentation form or however you do it by being really crisp with the rest of the team. This is the fundamental reason this prototype landed with this audience. I don't know everything, but I can tell you, I'm pretty sure this is sacred and this thing that we need to remember throughout the rest of the project. And you can very easily lose that, since it's often game teams that sort of for a technology reason or a scaling reason, like put that lesson to the test. And the number of times like a lone senior lead designer stuck up a hand and say, guys, remember when we were prototyping and we realized that X is important, and everyone's like, oh, that's right, we can't do that. Like you're, the one of my favorite prototyping, if not my favorite prototyping GDC talk, is the Action Blocks Titanfall 2 talk. I think it's Chris Dion, where they talked about how they built a machine for Titanfall 2 where they had one designer developing one prototype within constraints, I think every 3 to 7 days. And that it was only evaluated as a set. Individual prototypes were not that high stakes because they weren't trying to sort of draw profound lessons from one prototype that often. Once they had 40, they looked at the set and sort of squinted and sort of thought about what type of like box does that give for sort of what Titanfall 2 campaign is. Like what is the shape it's allowed to occupy within? Validate that. If you think if you look at 40 prototypes and you think you come to conclusions and that's what you're bringing to an audience validation test for Titanfall 2 campaign, $5, your designers are ready to commit, ready to sort of really say, we think we understand what this is, and we're ready to sort of like start building proper shippable missions. For me, that's the dream, but you get that from prototyping as a set, not a smaller number of higher stake prototypes, which is where I feel like teams go wrong. They're like, no, we're going to spend 3 months on this one build, and that one build is going to do the thing. And I'm like, dude, you will not be in a position to make the most of it because you don't have the broader pattern, and you don't have dead prototypes that are sort of telling you where the boundaries are and where the lessons are. Okay. Like, one of my biggest prototyping lessons is very often the best prototypes are not good. They're provocative. They create debate within your team as to what the boundaries are and what's happening and what's working. And you have people that have passionate feelings that this is the future and this is exactly the heart of the IP. And have other people saying it's like death and should be avoided and that we need to remove it. That's where you actually get the lessons and commitment, even if it's controversial, to proceed into another project phase. And you're in a position to make the most of your audience validation. Without that, I just feel like the audience validation, like, it'll help. It's not bad, but your team is still at a loss as to sort of their grasp of sort of what even works and why.